Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPautos.com, your libertarian car guy. I wanted to talk about something this morning that occurred to me the other day with regard to what are generally referred to as alternative fuels, and specifically an alternative that I consider to be a much better one than the one that's being pushed by the federal government, meaning, of course, battery-powered vehicles, which we're told we absolutely have to transition over to in order to prevent the climate from changing. At any rate, back in the 90s, I'm just going to set the stage here, I had an opportunity to test drive a number of compressed natural gas-powered vehicles that were in the prototype stage that were put together by General Motors and Ford. And I remembered it the other day, and I thought, wow, whatever happened to those vehicles? Well, that begs some interesting questions, doesn't it? You may not be aware of compressed natural gas vehicles and why that's an alternative that seems to me to be make a whole lot more sense than battery-powered vehicles, chiefly because they solve pretty much every one of the problems that you get with a battery-powered vehicle. Let's go through them bit by bit. The chief one being that it's no problem to put CNG into a vehicle quickly, at least not in principle. The main difference between a vehicle that's powered by compressed natural gas and gasoline is that the CNG has to be kept under pressure, whereas of course gasoline is in a liquid state at room temperature. So you have to have pressurized tanks, and you have to have a method of transferring the CNG from a pressurized storage tank into a pressurized fuel tank. But that's not an insuperable problem. In fact, it's already been done. If you have a propane tank, propane is essentially the same thing as CNG. You already know about this. You know, I've got a propane tank, and when it runs low, the guy in the tanker truck shows up and he hooks up his line and he refills my 200-pound tank in about 10 minutes. You can imagine how quickly it would be possible to fill up a 15-gallon equivalent tank inside of a car. You know, it would probably take as much or as little time as it takes to fully fuel up the gas tank in a conventional car. The only thing that's needed is making the mechanism essentially the equivalent of a gas pump, something that anybody can easily and safely use. And that's not an insuperable problem. It is an insuperable problem, or at least it's one that hasn't been solved yet, how to instill electric charge into a high voltage electric battery quickly. You know, you've heard them talk about fast chargers, and sure, they're faster than the length of time that it takes to charge up a battery at home, which is several hours at the very least, and that's if you have a so-called level 2 240 volt charging circuit in your house. So best case scenario, a few hours, typically overnight. It's a long time. So at a fast charger, as they call them, you can instill a partial charge in 15-20 minutes or so. But that's not very fast, is it? And it's only a partial charge. And it's not going to get any faster unless there's some breakthrough, as they put it, in battery technology and also safety technology, because it is challenging, let's put it that way, to instill several hundred volts of electricity into a battery without the potential of a fire increasing to unacceptable levels and without potentially damaging the battery as well. So that's the reason why you can only get a partial charge at a fast charger, up to 80%. That's the maximum. After that, the system slows down to limit the chances of a fire or damaging the battery. Another problem is that electricity, generally speaking, unless you've got a massively high-powered solar array, which most people don't, has to be directly connected to the source where it's generated. That's why you see power lines everywhere you go. Trace those power lines back, and eventually you'll get back to a substation and then to a generating plant. CNG, just like gasoline, is a fuel that can be trucked from wherever the depot is to wherever the station is, and then distributed at that point, which makes it a lot easier to place refueling stations for both gasoline and potentially CNG pretty much anywhere. Not a problem. Another thing is, there is essentially a limitless supply of CNG in this country. From what I've read, several hundred years of supply any rate more than enough to offset any worries about running out anytime soon. CNG also burns exceedingly cleanly, to the extent that oil change intervals can be extended, and spark plugs pretty much will last forever. There is no meaningful pollution associated with CNG, except of course the dread gas carbon dioxide, if you believe that the climate is changing on account of that. And if you believe that, I've got a property in Brooklyn, a bridge that I'm interested in selling, and you might want to get in touch with me. So, why is it that CNG powered vehicles aren't being promoted or even encouraged? Why doesn't anybody even hear about it? Whereas, there's this big aggressive push to push people into battery powered vehicles. And I think it has to do with the fact that the CNG vehicles actually work. They work so well, in fact, that Americans could go back to, average Americans, not rich ones, average Americans, people like you and me, most of you listening to this, could go back to driving large rear-wheel drive and V8 powered vehicles. The CNG vehicles that I got to test drive back in the 90s were converted versions of the Ford Crown Victoria, which you can't get anymore. They stopped selling it in 2011, which was a full-size rear-wheel drive V8 powered sedan, but it was not a high-priced sedan. It was a kind of car that Americans used to very commonly drive. Now only rich people can drive them, because only rich people can afford to spend $100,000 on a car, and that's the kind of money that it takes today to buy something that has a V8 engine that's rear-wheel drive, that's full size. You can still buy a truck with a V8, but even you're looking at $50,000 on the low end for a truck, and a lot of those transact for $60,000 to $70,000, and that really does put them out of reach of most people. But they're ideal for CNG because they're big, and they've got plenty of room to put a couple of CNG tanks in. Another nice thing about CNG is that you don't have to redesign the vehicle or the engine around the CNG. You can convert any gasoline engine to run on CNG. You can do it for a non-preposterous amount of money, which brings us to the affordability issue, which would help America. So why is it that we're not hearing more about it? I think that that's an interesting question. And again, I think it has to do with the fact that CNG-powered vehicles, that's an alternative that would actually work. And they don't want us to have alternatives that work. What they want is for the majority of us to not own or drive cars. I know that sounds a little crazy, but bear in mind the crazy times that we live in. And I can tell you this as somebody who has been covering this issue professionally for more than 30 years now, so I have seen and have read some of the internal urban planning documents, and I know what these people are wanting long term. And long term, they regard the car as something that's got to go, at least for most of us. That's the attitude that these people have. I can assure you that they themselves aren't going to be riding bicycles a la Pete Buttigieg, or taking the bus, just as they are not going to be living in 500 square foot apartments and eating a vegan Z-Bug lifestyle. That's for us. So you might want to consider that, and you might want to also have a look into CNG powered vehicles for yourself to see what I'm talking about, and perhaps ask why yourselves. Why is it that these vehicles aren't in greater circulation, as they really would help to ameliorate a lot of the problems that we have with EVs, and would certainly, I think, help to make America great again. Anyway, more over at EP Autos. Thanks as always for viewing, and we will catch up with you again soon.